from a new media senior, Josh. Would you like to announcement?
Hi, how's everyone doing tonight? Students are over here. My name is Josh. Right now, we're working on something new. It's called, right now, the New Media Club. It's an interesting new collective of students that don't necessarily have to be in the major. They could be anyone that has a general interest in new media and arts that are related to new media. We're having our first club meeting, which is going to act as a very organizational and preparatory meeting where we don't have much information to disperse, and it's going to be more of a brainstorming session. That's going to occur after the symposium is completed at 8:30 in the stew by the couches. You all can come around, shed some ideas, share some ideas, get some feedback. But that's about it. Enjoy the lecture.
That's the perfect way to begin tonight, right? The announcement for new collective action. Thanks, Josh. Awesome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Brooke Singer. I'm a professor in the New Media program here at Curated, and co-organizer of tonight's events and exhibition in the Passage Gallery, which I'm super, super thrilled. It's very exciting to see something that you've hoped for and worked towards, organized, emailed, worried, arranged, rearranged with multiple people from, afar and near, for this event to happen, which is really important and kind of a first for us here in the media and Purchase College to bring this archive to campus and to show it in its full glory and to potentially keep it on campus. So that's in the works, and we'll see how that goes. But of course, events like this, there are many people to acknowledge, many people who work very hard and hold this event and the exhibition and the archive dear to our hearts. And first and foremost are the folks here from the Franklin Street Works Gallery, Terri, Smith, and Sandrine Milet. And the whole reason this exists is because of them. It's their brainchild. And the first instance of the archive was at the gallery. I wandered in a year plus ago on the voting of Michelle Stewart, and was thrilled by what I saw. My first question is, where is this going next? And the answer was, well, we don't know. I was like, well, where is the archive going to be archived? And they're like, well, we don't know. So that's when I kind of got involved, and my sticky fingers kind of pulled them this way to our campus. If you have not been to the Franklin Street Works Gallery, it's amazing. It's 20 minutes away via car. I'm sure there are other ways to get there. I don't know. But it's really a breath of fresh air. It's amazing, experimental, innovative art space in somewhat dull, not so vibrant Stamford. Can I say that? Although it's becoming much more vibrant because of their hard work and the great shows that they're curating and sharing with the community and with us. They're also the Purchase students. We had a great team of interns, Bonnie Muncada and Diogo Salles from the graphic design program, did all of the gorgeous graphics for the, you didn't pick one up, the book, the essays, and the e-bite and the posters. Really worked hard and worked very closely with us to come up with something that we felt represented the spirit and content of this archive. Gina Viscianti, who worked as also an art and design student. I don't know what her major is. Are you here, Gina? What I did hear about her today is that she's got a photographic memory, and she absorbed the archive and spat it back out in beautiful, eloquent, and insightful ways. So that is beyond awesome, and her essay is included along with mine and Sandrine's and intro by Terri in this handout. And the last student who worked with us is Stephen Barakat, who is an arts management major. He worked with the installation design. There's Gina, right? Yep. Hi, Gina. I just sang your praises. So Stephen helped with installation support and did the hard work once you got here. And so thank you, Stephen. Jacqueline Shilkoff and the whole Passage Gallery crew. Boys really putting in long hours and helping out and solving problems. Jacqueline, we could not do any of this ever. The lecture series, everything in the Passage Gallery is due to your hard work and diligence and expertise along with others. And of course, the School of Film and Media Studies, Michelle Stewart, Martha and Lorraine, I think they probably took off.
Got to go home, yeah.
They got to go home. But they dealt with our crazy questions and were very patient as always. So thanks to the school for your hard work. I just want to say very briefly, we've got a great lineup and a full packed couple of hours. So I want to start by saying these few words to set a tone. Kind of suggest that now is a time for politically and socially engaged art. It's a really good time for this kind of work. There are categories that are defining it and defending it, make it easier to do it, justify it, I guess. There are even art grants that solely support it. There are critics and curators who champion it tirelessly. There's the internet. How awesome is the internet? Push a button and make it go global, right? We love the internet. But most of all, there are a lot of crises that need this kind of work, that need our attention and this kind of creative spotlight for critical discussion. It's not been always this way, that the climate will change again. Socially and politically engaged art will go out of fashion, and it will not be in favor and have so many friends. So that's one reason this archive is really very important. An archive like this on a college campus serves another purpose, and I write the kind of last sentence in the essay. I'm going to quote myself. We have done this to nourish minds and spirits and incite you to join, continue the work, and claim for your own. So without further ado, Terri is going to come here, Terri Smith, and say a few words to you.
Hello. What's the tallest one? Thank you, Brooke, for thanking everyone, because I'm sure I would have been that annoying Oscar person that just stood there and stuttered and got after people. But thank you for inviting us. Jacqueline and Chris, thank you for saving us with the walls and the everything, and the AV. I have to thank Sandrine Milet again, because she's literally would be I'd be in a straitjacket right now if I would have to do all this by myself. So, and thank you all for coming. You already said most of the things about the art space. I mean, we're not for profit. We have a cafe, so if we're on your way home and you want to do a little work in the cafe and have a coffee or a beer, feel free. And I don't know how many of you guys know Tim Davis, the photographer, but I've stolen his thing where he doesn't know this yet, where I take a picture of the audiences. So can I take your picture? All right, okay, so I'm count to 3. You may not all be in it. Okay, 1, and stay still because it's a really slow shutter speed. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'll look at it later. I'll make sure you all look good. Okay, so I'm just gonna just do a really quick thing about how we're all here, which pretty much is all about Greg Sholette over here. Essentially, I curated a show called House Arrest in the spring of 2012. And one of the components of that was we asked all the artists what books they were reading. And one of the artists was reading Dark Matter by Gregory Sholette. When I got through that show and had that month where I gave myself an excuse to actually read again, I started reading his book. And then we decided to do a 1-year anniversary show about alternative art spaces. And I started thinking about his chapter on the political art documentation and distribution archive, project and archive, or group and archive. And that became one component of the exhibition. So essentially an artist led me to him, and then he led me to other artists. And I think that's one of the great things about curating, and one of the really nice things. I mean, collectives happen on purpose because people decide to make one, but I think in a lot of ways we're kind of always a collective if we keep our minds open to it and pay attention. So, Greg, do your thing.
Thank you so much, Terri and Brooke and Sandrine. It's really fantastic what you put together here. And you mentioned, Brooke, in your comments about the idea that political art, activist art, kind of comes and goes, it rises and falls. And I was thinking about that in particular because, you know, I worked with people. I'm older now, but I work with people who are older than me, and there's this kind of interesting way that we were like generations discussing things from previous generations. So, for example, Lise Soskolne, who had been around 20 or so years before me, and she also said, you know, these things, they rise and they fall. You know, you can think of the 1840s, you can think of the 1870s, the 1920s and 30s, of course, the 60s, 70s, and then really the last 15 years, the kind of intensity again. But another way to look at it is, of course, actually this kind of activist, engaged cultural work, collective work has been going on, and every once in a while something else kind of intercedes. It could flip the paradigm around. Yeah. One of the things I want you to think about is the paradox that we have with this whole project in a way, the archive and activism. Now, what a strange thing to put together. I mean, what's your impression of an archive? You know, think about it a second. Boxes, right? Folders and things that are covered in dust. Static. It doesn't move. It's not active. And I think it's really an interesting notion to ask yourself how those things go together. You could just simply say, well, you know, obviously they're kind of a collision, but you could also think about the idea that what happens if the archive is almost given the opportunity to sort of enact itself. What if it could actually sort of stand up and express its own thingness or its own agency in some kind of strange way? And so I'd like to think of these kind of projects, and some of the ones I'm going to show you, as an attempt to kind of give agency to what is not really alive necessarily, but has the investment of life in it in so many different kinds of ways. Right? But give it agency in a way that makes it kind of break out of its place. Gives it some place to go. Now, let's see, we're jumping ahead here. I had to show you this first, because you may or may not know that along with the attacks on September 11th a few years ago, there was also a very famous, 40 years ago, takeover of the Chilean government by the United States and other countries. Back in Pinochet, who took over a legally elected government in Chile. Right? And I had to mention it because it's been 40 years, but also because of this document here, which is one of the documents in the PAD archive, or Political Art Documentation Distribution, that Terri mentioned. And I'll come back to that in a minute. What you're looking at is actually a folder which shows the recreation of a mural that had been done as this coup was taking place 40 years ago to protest the coup, but a mural that was recreated in Soho, New York, by artists. There was no internet in those days. You know, it was difficult sometimes to get information, except through newspapers, etc. And mainstream newspapers didn't carry details like this. But people, artists, others who knew people who were in Chile and other places could create kind of communication link, right? And this is another way that the archive has a kind of weird life to it. Right? It's this kind of weird sort of series of networks or routing that take place. But we also have to ask the question, is the archive history? And I would say maybe not. Like maybe historians would say, well, the archive is what you build your history on. Because we think of history as a kind of narrative. But then I go back to this question of, well, what if the archive speaks for itself? How does that disrupt that standard idea that the archive is this kind of material that you then interpret? If the archive got up and interpreted itself. I studied with Hans Haken at Cooper Union, and one of the things that I realized about the work that he had done, others had done in the late 60s and 70s was they were artists who began to say, well, why do we have to wait for critics to come and tell everybody what we're doing? What if we simply stood up and represented ourselves in this way, in this kind of intellectual fashion? And they were kind of dubbed the conceptual artists or idea artists. But it's an important moment, I think, within the notion of art history. And I include here not just art, visual art, painting, sculpture, but also media, etc., and underground film, etc. It's an important moment when artists began to step forward and say, we actually have some authority over what we do, how we represent it, how we interpret it, and in a sense, how we look at the past. So I want to quickly show you a precursor to how I got interested in all of this, because in 1998, I was hired by the New Museum to be the curator of education, and we were doing exhibitions. That's a long story in itself. Curators of education, doing exhibitions. That was causing some problems. But one of them was going to be urban encounters, and I was thinking about these these activist groups that I was part of, political art, documentation, distribution, and another one called Repo History, which I won't have time to talk about. How they just kind of vanished. They're not on the map. You get an art history book out, it's very difficult to find anything about these groups, and a lot of other groups like that. Now, things are shifting a little now, but I think Brooke's absolutely right. Let's go forward 50 years, 25 years. You're going to find a lot of what we're seeing, and even this exemplary work that's in this archive, it's not going to be in the story. Okay. So the question about self-narration, how do you narrate your own history? I decided to do a show about artist collectives, 1998, when there weren't that many active collectives, at least not in New York City. And I asked, I think it was 6 different collectives, could you build like a kiosk that would represent what you had done, but also link it to the past, so that we could kind of see how you arrived at where you did now, years later. So Urban Encounters was in the basement of what was the renovated New Museum. Now that was still in Soho, not the new building. And for example, ABC No Rio, which was originally an illegal squat. It started as an illegal squat, it became a sort of city-owned property. It's a complicated history. They created these kiosks to tell the story of their own adventures and having to break into the building to create their own space. And a lot of these graphics are by Seth Tabachman. This was a kiosk. Inside was a interactive CD-ROM. It was a totally exciting new technology, right? And it just kept breaking down the whole time. But they had created, and I think it's actually on the website now, all the same material. They created this kind of multi-level material that you could examine about the history. The other thing about this kiosk is they were trying to show the different eras in the space, which is downtown Manhattan. And there were like community groups that would meet there. There were punk groups, zine groups, bands, peace groups, etc. In other words, the space was a kind of multi-purpose space. And it was also an art space. ABC No Rio. Another project was Bullet Space. Bullet Space was, at the time in 1998 that I did the show, still an illegal squat in New York City. There's very few, maybe none left in New York City at this point. And even Bullet Space has become legit, but it wasn't there. They had broken in, taken the space over, created a workshop downstairs with silk screening the factory, and they created all kinds of work. In fact, they even did a show on the building. I believe it was on East 3rd Street in the Lower East Side. Poster project on their building at some point in the past, probably 1986, 87, 88, they were around in the 80s. And then they put this installation inside the exhibition at New Museum in the basement. And you see those bottles on the top of the roof. I didn't realize what they were doing. This was in a sense one of the things that when you have a squat, you have to protect it to some degree against the sheriffs and the police. So you often booby trap the entrances so that the police kind of know not to go barging in and try to throw everybody out. And one way to do that is to take bottles of urine and put them precariously over doorways and windows so that they fall down. Well, that's exactly what they installed at New Museum. And I was told this, I think, just hours before the show opened, which for me was okay, but I know that some people really started to freak out. Just say I wasn't at the New Museum much longer. It was a close to things. Guerrilla Girls, this was the first time Guerrilla Girls actually came up with sort of, I say sort of marketing material. They had took this opportunity to create little kits that you could get at the bookstore. And inside the kits were these various things that turned you into a Guerrilla Girl inspector. You could go to different spaces, not just art galleries, theater, etc., fill out questionnaires and how many women do you have working here, how many people of color are here, etc., etc. In other words, you became part of their sort of collective in this kind of way. They sold them at the gift shop, which was downstairs. And for women, I think it was like a $2 item. For men, I think it was like $5 or something. And some of them were kissed by the Guerrilla Girls, and those were $25. Godzilla, an Asian American collective, I let them create their own timeline. There were actually various timelines so that they could, in a way, take their own archive and interpret it. You know? And you can imagine there's a lot of conflicts when you work in groups. I don't have to tell everybody in this group who's worked in a group, a collective, how complex that can be, how difficult it can be, how you can stop talking to people in collective very quickly. So you have this very interesting, almost kind of conflictual, but also at the same time collective sort of project of self-representation. And World War III, I told you Seth Bachman mentioned again, he was a founding member. World War III Comics is an underground comic illustration group. They do graphic novels, etc. We actually infiltrated what was the New Museum bookstore at the time and set up a display inside the sort of marketing area and had them put stencils on the wall. I don't think they would ever do that today. Unfortunately, this may be all too appropriate at the current moment. There was a brochure that was created for this show, and if you go to my archive site, it's just Dark Matter Archives, one word, .net. You can find this and you can download it as a PDF. In fact, I have a lot of material up there that might be of interest. So this is, of course, the New Museum now. It's located, for those of you who haven't been there, in the neighborhood. Really, it's called the Lower East Side. It's downtown, Lower Manhattan, etc. It used to be very much an immigrant neighborhood. A lot of history, a lot of political history. It used to be very, very poor. It's changing rapidly. Perhaps in part because of the museum. But I wanted to focus for a second on one of the other projects in the show. And maybe this comes back to my theme about self-representation. Because we included in the exhibition a kiosk about PADD, political art documentation distribution. So let me just show you. This was one of the columns in the basement. We constructed this sort of platform around the table. You could go up and you could fill out a card, which was on that sort of rotating, this sort of thing here. Those were cards from the PAD archive, which I'm going to talk about in a second, which was literally an archive with card catalogs in it. The blue, you could actually take one and you could add your own information, drop it in a slot that was in the table, and then we would laminate it, incorporate it into this kind of growing archive. It's kind of interactive, that was the idea. But a little bit of a diversion before I come to PAD. This was a location where PAD had done a project against gentrification in 1984. And we had plastered up in the upper left, it's a little hard to see, the side of this building with anti-gentrification posters made by different artists. This is a project by PADD. And again, I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a second. There's a close-up down here. And this is what the building looked like at the time of the exhibition in '98. Now it's actually a very fancy restaurant. This is the corner of 10th and Avenue A, right at Tompkins School of Art. So we were trying to incorporate this idea of history, of change, into sort of this installation, and very much the way the city had been altered. This was from that original exhibition in '84, sort of ominous speculator, which we just kind of, we pasted in all different places around the city. At that time, in the neighborhood, you could go and you could put stuff almost anywhere. Like it wasn't illegal, it was illegal, but it wasn't illegal just to walk down the street. Today, you feel almost like, if you move too slowly, you're probably breaking the law. So, just installing this archive, PADD, political art documentation, started in 1980. It was boxes of materials that the critic, activist Lise Soskolne had been collecting about socially engaged art that she invited people to send to her, not realizing that it would soon accumulate in her loft in Soho to the point where she was like desperate. So we had a meeting. I had never known these people. I went to this meeting. And she said, I need people to help me archive this material. She wanted to turn it into an archive. And she wanted to turn it into an archive that actually would be a teaching archive, a sort of an activist archive, if you will, something that could actually show people different ways to make socially engaged art. Now, today there's lots of examples of it. Obviously, the internet's helped the work David Thompson, Bishop, Brooke, everyone's doing. But in those days, 1980, it actually was kind of a dirty word to put art and politics together. There were not many examples. There were people, like my Professor Altaka, who could also be called a conceptual artist, and he kind of got off the hook a little bit, you know? But people who did more explicitly political art, well, that always harkened back to something from the 1920s and 30s, which was roundly condemned by the art world. It had been written mostly out of art history at the time. So we were kind of pushing against the grain in 1980. We wanted to create this art, and we wanted to show people that people are doing this all over. We started this thing, big group of people. Maybe it was as many in this room at first, and then it thinned down. Pretty quickly we realized nobody wanted to sit around archiving anything. This is boring. What are you talking about? I'm going to archive other people's art. No, I'm not going to do that. So everybody broke into groups. There was an activist committee, there was a newsletter committee, this is the newsletter, and so on and so forth. A couple of people stuck with the archive. Mimi Smith, Barbara Moore, absolutely devoted. There were others who helped her. They were really rock solid there for like 15, almost 20 years they worked on this. The group itself disappeared, and they were still working on this archive. Another example of the newsletter. So along with the boxes that Lucy Lepard had, people started donating things for the archive. They went out and they would actually collect stuff off the street. You know? The problem was that the group, PADD, never really gave them an explicit sense of what the archive should consist of, except that it should be about social and political art, which is incredibly broad in a way if you think about it. In fact, it was so broad that they decided there was nothing that they couldn't actually accept if it was donated to the archive, with the exception of one thing that came in. Someone mailed in some engravings of cats. And they thought that, well, we just don't see a way to include this. Other than that, this archive is rather heterogeneous. It's really kind of wild and fuzzy, right? And now it sits in the basement, excuse me, not really the basement, in the warehouse in Queens, in New York, of the Museum of Modern Art. Now, it's too complicated to get into the whole story, but they wanted to acquire the archive after someone did a major exhibition using the archive. Deborah W.A.G.E, who was then the curator of prints and graphics. And she just retired in the last couple of years. She used the archive to get that exhibition together, which was condemned. I'll show you one of the announcements. And then they got the archive, and I'm pretty sure that they actually initiated their own archives about the same time. It's now out in Queens where they keep a lot of things in the warehouse. And I went there while I was working on the book Dark Matter, that Terri was nice enough to mention. And they let me go back into the shelves. Because normally you have to write, I want to see this box, or I want to see this folder, and they bring it out. They have to go back and then they open stuff up. It was great. And so I started taking pictures of things. And in a way I was revisiting my own past. I found notes that I'd scribbled on the back of a piece of paper on what I was doing. A sketch for probably the Great Wall of Los Angeles, if anybody knows that. G. Baca. Groups and collectives that have long since just kind of disappeared. This is the recreation of the Chilean world. And I often show these in different places around the world, and sometimes people will say, hey, wait a minute, I know that still exists. And then I make notes about, okay, because it's very difficult sometimes to find out what these things were. Not all of them. Some of them I have no idea what this is. That's interesting. I do know Vinny Salas. He was involved in our anti-gentrification work, critiquing Mayor Koch at the time. Carnival Knowledge, which is a group that really deserves a lot more attention. I think there's a young scholar just beginning to work on them. They were a feminist pro-sex collective. This is 1980s. and they kind of looked something like this. This was a photograph taken for the Village Voice. They began working with porn stars and sex workers, creating carnival-like experiences. It's too much to get into here, but they were really quite interesting in a lot of ways. And they had proposed a very elaborate exhibition, which obviously was never constructed, of a woman laying prone, that you went inside and you had all this kind of different experience about sex inside. I'm not sure what this was actually proposed for, but it didn't happen. Things that didn't happen, right? That's a lot of what's in archives. Stuff that didn't happen, or stuff that happened that you really don't know anything about. Anti-catalog. This is actually a really interesting document for people who do art history, because it was probably the first social art history project in the United States, based on John Berger's work, which you may know ways of seeing. This is on my darkmatterarchives.net website. You can download the PDF. It's almost impossible to get a copy of it. But it's like a counter-biennial catalog from Mexico, which was, again, long story, but created by a series of collectives in Mexico that were asked to be part of the Paris biennial. And then it discovered, they thought, at least, that someone was going to undermine the credibility of their work, and they created their own catalog. Complicated stuff, interesting stuff. Lots of anti-Reagan. Or this is one of my favorites. A detorn of what's the Newman's comic, Canyon? Anyway, it used to be popular in newspapers. They simply see why don't you and your boys just get the fuck out of so. This is during when the United States was really on the verge of invading Central America again. A document within the documents, right? Documents about the documents. This was the paper, this was the letter moving the archives into the Museum of Modern Art. And this was a review of the exhibition that I mentioned. I think this is Hilton Kramer, right? Good old Hilton Kramer. There's been lots of attempts to sort of figure out, well, what the hell is modern art? What is all this stuff that's happened ever since, whatever we would say, the late 1900s, I guess, right? And Alfred Barr, who was one of the first directors of the Museum of Modern Art, came up with these elaborate schemes to show how these different forces and these different groups and these different ideas moved around. He also came up with schemas like this, several of them actually, which was like a torpedo moving through time, I don't know, time and space. And you have, of course, American art in the front, including Mexico, American being the entire continent, right? And European art starts to move towards the back, and we're traveling along. So one of the questions I might put forward, here's the Pat archive, a dissident archive, an archive of too much stuff, fuzzy stuff, crazy stuff, all over the place stuff. No cats. An archive that really is difficult to represent because it's so sprawling and full of surplus. And it's in the kind of the basement, let's say, of the museum. Okay, it's in Queens, but it's like off somewhere, right? What function does it have within that institution? And where would it be on this diagram if you were to imagine the archive, which is now part of the museum, and obviously part of the narrative of art? That's the building. Just want to finish on a project that I'm working on now called Imaginary Archive. And in a way, I'm asking the question of archives from maybe a different angle, which is I invite artists, and not even artists, various people of different types. I ask them to produce a document about a past whose future never took place. And maybe it's a future that should have taken place. Maybe in some cases it's a future that we're glad didn't take place. But the idea is to create an archive of documents about history that might have been. And I have taken it so far to New Zealand, to Ireland, and I'm going to Austria next week to install it. And then in the spring I'm taking it to Kiev in Ukraine. And what's interesting is I always get local people to produce some of the work and others. What's really interesting is that when people are asked that question, if they try to produce a work that ostensibly should be about history in some way, they almost inevitably try to do something about the present and about the politics that are going on now. And so that's really been kind of exciting. It was really kind of what I hoped for was that this archive would not be stuck in the past, it would be propelled, maybe not quite like a torpedo, into the present. So works about Occupy, works about social practice as an emerging field. This is by Josh McPhee, who's one of the founders of Just Seeds, and he's in the exhibition. Todd A. Young's Alien Abduction Collective. And they come in various things. Some people make album covers, some people make like books, some people are making stickers in this case. Or Jeffrey Stoller's Imagine movie poster for Eisenstein's movie on Capitol, which he never made. You know, what would it have been, and what would the poster look like? And so sometimes the archive looks like this. This is Ireland. This is from New Zealand. And you see one of the PAD newsletters, because I also include other documentation in there. And then also, in most cases, I've been able to put some of the work in what I call satellite spaces. So downtown New Zealand, a bookstore that was willing to put some of the pieces in the window, including this piece here. These are excerpts from it by Evgeny Fix, and it's a communist guide to the Museum of Modern Art. In other words, all the artists who actually were members of the Communist Party, done in a brochure form that looks very much like an authentic Museum of Modern Art brochure. And so these are the kind of interventions that I'm hoping to sort of create with this archive. And this is ideally what it's going to look like in Graz. I sent them this image, and they have to build it. So that's kind of nice. I don't know how many artists get a chance to do it. Usually you do it yourself, but in this case, they're going to set it up. And I want you to just draw your attention to that quote by Jacques Derrida from Archive Fever, which is a really interesting book. I mean, I've read it, maybe not through completely 3 times, but every time I read it, I come away with another interpretation, which is kind of an interesting point about the archive, right? When you dive into it, and you begin to try to make sense of it, your narrative can constantly be shifted and constantly be rewritten. Very different than our idea of official history. And in a sense, it always has to do with the future. Because the future is when the archive actually begins to make sense, not in the present. Okay, thank you so much.
Format, we're going to hold questions until all 3 speakers go. And yeah.
Hi, my name is Michael Bell-Smith. I too am a professor of new media here at Purchase. And it is my honor to introduce Brian House this evening. Along with Sue Huang, Brian founded the collective Knifeandfork in 2004. Working with a wide range of collaborators, Knifeandfork's practice is characterized by participatory interventions that utilize humor, narrative, and a wide range of media, both traditional and new. Their work has been shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles under the Engagement Party program, the Beale Center of Art and Technology at the University of California, Irvine, and Kulturhuset in Stockholm. In 2008, Knifeandfork received a commission from Ryzen. In addition to his work with the collective, Brian works as an artist, a solo artist as well. And he characterizes this work as traversing alternative geographies, experimental music, and a critical data practice. He was a member of New York Times Research and Development Lab, where his work was recognized by Time in their 50 Best Inventions of 2011. He's done technology at the award-winning design studio Local Projects. His work has been exhibited in museums including MoMA, MoCA, Rhizome, at the New Museum, Los Angeles County Exhibitions, and on and on. He currently teaches in the Digital and Media program at the Rhode Island School of Design. and is a doctoral student at Brown University in the Music and Modern Culture and Media departments. Please welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for that, and thanks Brooke for inviting me, and everyone contributed to making the exhibition, which is really awesome. So, Knifeandfork is super long to myself, and so in 2009 we had a residency at MoCA in LA, and we did a series of events. And here's one of the kind of blog reviews of it. This is mine. And this was an interesting experience doing this type of work in a museum context. And that, I'm sorry to say that she felt it was an epic failure. There were too many people, many of them were hipsters, and the museum was unprepared. People were cheating, they were screwing up, and with her doing the logical thing, which was to retreat to the bar. And this is how she ends her review. In any case, yeah, that was our kind of favorite review of the show. And I'm not trying to make fun of her. I think it was a meaningful and kind of telling reaction. So, working in a museum was kind of an uncomfortable prospect for us initially. The motivation of this piece was really to take two understood modes of inhabiting space, right? So we're thinking, okay, how do people interact according to rules? And the museum going was one of them, right? You walk through a particular pace, you look at things in a particular way. And mini golf is another. So, we managed to piss off our blogger on kind of both counts. Which I view as a success of sorts, right? So she took those modes pretty seriously, the rules involved, and was mad when they were broken. But it was actually a very fun night overall. And so some of the perks of this, when you actually score in the whole phone call, and an actor on the other side will talk to you about the nature of emptiness and form. And it'll also make a bell ring in the courtyard, and they'll cook a donut bowl. So working in MoCA, you see us going through kind of the backspaces of the museum and interacting with staff. And I think it raised the questions that MoCA wanted us to raise, or thought it did anyway. So what are the goals of participatory arts practice? What role does the institution and museum like MoCA play in this, and should it play any role? Are we mounting a critique, or are we entertainers? Or could this be social practice, in the sense of having some community goals? Or is the venue itself just antithetical to that type of work? To be honest, though, I'm not sure if it was about any of that for us, at least initially. So this is actually the inspiration for the collective, which also happens to be kind of a canonical precedent for media arts practice. And I'm sure some of you know this work. It's Raymond Queneau and his 100,000 billion, I think that's right, poems. And the concept here is he wrote 10 sonnets, right? And each one had 14 lines. But every line of each of those 10 sonnets could be exchanged with the same line from any of the others. So instead of 10 sonnets, you had 10 to the 14th sonnets, which is a huge number, right? So it's so big that should you open this up and cut the pages and flip randomly around and read one of these versions, you are likely to be the only person to ever have read that poem, even at this state in history. So, so Sue and I discovered that piece together when we met as art students in Sweden. It was bleak enough in the winter there that we've done most of our subsequent work in LA. In any case, Queneau's poem is a text, right? And within the form, there's an implicit action on the part of the reader. And it goes further than turning pages to actually cutting the page, right? I thought that was great. There's this notion of the text there's instructions, and then you have these design constraints, and you put that together with the serendipity of participation, and you get something that's self-generating. And that was fascinating to us, and we were thinking about, hey, how can we do this, in other media? How can we respond to, new technologies that are emerging? So, in all our pieces, the common element is really that Sue and I, as a duo, always end up with one or more additional collaborators in the collective. And they actually give it form with the participants in it. So, the agency can be confused and can get interesting. So this is from a piece that wasn't planned, per se. It actually happened because Sue's phone was stolen in downtown LA. She, set it down on a bar or something, and it walked away. But it so happened that the day before we had installed tracking software on it that I had developed. And so, there's a certain misfortune here, but we were also just kind of huddled around the map on the computer and watching this phone as it, went to the valley and back to downtown, and went to the suburbs, and we figured out where the thief lived, and that's a whole other story. But I rigged something up that took those, latitude and longitude points and converted them into Google directions. So, this text that was continually generated as it moved around was, essentially tracing out what was happening. And once we had the directions, we decided to have Google Street View drive it. So we took each of those points, interpolated between them, scraped down the Google Street View tiles, and stitched it together into this movie. So it's kind of like the Google car is the getaway car or something along those lines. And so, so what are we looking at here? It's Sue's phone. So this is her personal data that's being represented here. But it's been hijacked, like possessed by this thief who's, traveling around LA. So we're seeing what he's seeing, except we're not seeing that. We're seeing, Google's version of this. In this case, the Google car was driving the opposite direction, so then he was going against traffic thing, which is weird. So this is kind of a framing data, stitching together of Google's frameworks, the data that we're generating in everyday life, the carrying around these tracking devices, and the realities, the social realities of Sue's interaction with the thief. She did get from that. And then there's some kind of wedge in here that lets us think about how we embody ourselves in media and the structures of validation that emerges. And it's really a conversation, living somewhere between us and the thief and Google. You can see the seasons change as they update tiles, which is kind of cool. Google Street View is this kind of timeless realm where it's always summer. I guess that way is not. So this is an earlier project of ours called Kumikoff, and this was also kind of about transportation. The way it was embedded into the S-Bahn system in Berlin. We did this for a festival there. And this was before the iPhone at all, but it used the capacity of the text message to change the context of one's immediate surroundings. So we've done several pieces with text messaging, and I think it gets to the core of kind of the structural shift in everyday life that mobile technology enables. The piece starts, we distributed these flyers around the city, and when you send a text message in, it directs you to go to one of the Ringbahn platforms. So there's this S-Bahn route that encircles the city. You tell it that you're there, and it'll tell you what train to get on. And once you do, you kind of become implicated in this narrative that's ongoing, it's always happening on the Ringbahn. We wanted to connect the SMS to the instruction-based work of the avant-garde in the 20th century. And so here you get these instructions that tell you to look for certain things outside of the landscape. So the window of the train becomes, in a way, cinematic, right? Location-specific messages come in, point out features of the landscape, you're reinterpreting them according to this narrative. That has to do with secrecy and transparency, and knowing who is on your side and who is not. And so the fun kind of thing about this is when you're on the train, there will be other participants in the project, also interacting or not interacting, being oblivious of each other's presence in this vehicle as you're circumnavigating the city. So another kind of piece along textual lines. This is at Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions. And this took the form of a drawing exercise in which a pair of participants, who are strangers, stay on the phone with each other. And one reads a series of literary texts about Hollywood, which is where the gallery is located. Sorry for the video here. And those texts have directional cues of people in the stories moving about the imagery. And the person who's walking around uses those cues to navigate the actual streets of Hollywood outside. And at a certain point, the text ceases, and the walker then describes their surroundings over the phone, and their partner draws. And so we get this nice collection of images that we can create an archive for and had it up in space. They have a blend of viewpoints that intuitively draw from the culture of cinema, the operations of the text that we kind of set out, and then the process of spoken language as they were on the phone with each other. So that's a few other projects you have, a taste of the kind of thing we do. And in thinking about this talk and from a prompt from Brooke, I began thinking about our individual work. This is one of Sue's photographs. And I realized that we're both really concerned with everyday life in our individual projects, and that our projects tend to be personal and contemplative when we're working alone. And those are the similarities, but otherwise, in terms of form and aesthetic and all this, we diverge pretty strongly. This is another of Sue's pieces. Honestly, she has a much better sensibility than I do. This is from her wires series, so she has videos of electrical wires as kind of abstract geometry. This one is called Bath Horizon, from her domestic spaces. So she's invoking landscapes and other kind of canonical painting forms by their formal elements with kind of minute everyday objects like the edge of the bathtub. And so my own recent work is, I was concerned with an interpretation of data. So I've been using sound as a means of visceralizing patterns in everyday life. So this is called the quotidian record. And it represents 1 year of data that I collected about my position. So what you're hearing is me moving around New York City. And one rotation of the record corresponds to 1 day of living time. So I've created this musical piece. You hear that pulsing, which is about 2-hour patterns. And you hear these commutes as I'm going home to work, to the studio, and repeating these motifs, and that'll kind of morph over time. I'll change keys when I go on vacation or whatever else. And for me, modification and control are really kind of typical tools of data collection today, right? So an essay, etc. And this is intended as one alternative means to relating to that data to restore some sense of subjectivity. It's fun for me to think about, okay, how can we take data, something digital, and then print it back into analog form, make it a tangible object. You actually have a performative or intuitive or nostalgic relationship to. So this is me, away from New York, Colorado, but it's also in some ways about reliving or reenacting encoded forms, and that's actually something that wasn't in my practice until I started working on this. It's something that comes from the night before this kind of reenacting the form. I'll show it in the piece now. my audio background kind of rarely comes into play in our work. And Sue happens to be a really brilliant illustrator, which we typically also bypass in the stuff that we do. But what we both have, which has been crucial to our collaboration, are technical skills. So we're really an even match when it comes to code and electronics, which are typically the materials of our work. And it means our thinking isn't divided, along those kinds of lines of production. So, we'll divide up labor, kind of out of necessity. But it's important for our practice that we're both able to take full responsibility, both for the final concept and how it's executed. And that's really not something that we work with more than 2 core collaborators, because it really is an incredibly inefficient process. But that's something that, in a way, is by design. So you might ask, okay, so why do we work together, at all, if that's the case? But I think you see in the examples I showed of our individual work and what we do together, the difference is really the social component of the pieces. So we're both, fairly introverted by nature, but because we're 2, our practice is based on these really intense, often multi-day long conversations, right, / heated arguments. And that intersubjective element between us and our process, I think, in turn, lends the concepts towards the possibility of participation from the public in ways that perhaps, are closed in our individual work that is arising from our committed kind of private thinking. And I'll say too, we don't have the luxury of really having a studio-based practice. So we've been working together for almost a decade now. And these conversations have been continuous, but we've never actually lived in the same city since originally going to school together in Sweden. For most of that, I've been in New York, and she was in LA. So the work itself comes together in response to specific situations, a commission or whatever kind of random opportunity we get, and that really becomes a part of the piece. We've actually never showed anything twice. None of our work has traveled, because it really is kind of where it's made. And so I think maybe the premise of the group has become, in itself, the idea of negotiating social constraints, right? So those we've been given in a particular situation, those we create for each other in our dialogue. And as a result, those that emerge in the work itself and are offered up to the public. So, everybody a soccer fan? 1986 World Cup. Argentina is at war with England, but they meet in the quarterfinal. Diego Maradona is the greatest player in the world at this point, arguably ever. And he does this. Which, you can see, he handballs it in. So, this was an infamous play. They went on to win the tournament. And he still cannot set foot in England, because of this play. It's known as the hand of God goal. Asked afterward, he said it was a little by the hand of God.
Welcome to Las Vegas Stadium in beautiful Mexico City. Okay, we're playing all night between Argentina and England. This is the 1986 FIFA World Cup. Argentina.
We had the good fortune of working with Enrique, who's, legit, knows more about this play. But we were interested in the fact that, that the media clip we saw has been played over and over and over again. On YouTube, there's thousands of different versions of it, and people have angry comments and everything today. So we thought, okay, can we just recreate this in the middle of this big Nancy Green sculpture right there? What would it take to kind of invoke this event? So we got a semi-pro soccer team. We laid down astroturf, marked out the play. We had a taco truck outside. And, we made replica jerseys, replica ball. But what you're seeing, though, so those are members of the public that have come, and 60 of them volunteered to play the role of Diego Maradona and try to recreate the play. Made a cherry picker with the video that had the exact angle and so forth. So it became really kind of a folk retelling, like a kinetic documentation of the thing that became kind of like ossified in legend. So each kind of representation variation there added something to the narrative of Maradona from LA and that moment. And then there was a point at this event where I was just sitting on the bleachers, right, just kind of surprised about everything was unfolding as much as anyone. And if that can be indicative of our work, I'd say really the process from beginning to end is about trying to artfully relinquish control. And that's, whether it's about what we think something should be or what we think something should be about, it's really we're seeking to find that gap, right? That ambivalence in the conversation between ourselves, between the public, and letting it be something, right? And I think that's really at the productive and political core of the way we interpret what that. So we're creating a new work for the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati in a year, so we'll be thrust into this museum scene again. So wish us luck and stay tuned for that next year. That's all I've got.
So I'm Steve Lambert. I'm a professor of new media here also. About 5 years ago, I was going through the tax returns of a non-profit arts organization. Without their permission, you actually don't need permission. You can get the tax returns of non-profit organizations. And a few months earlier, a few weeks earlier, I guess, they had asked me to be in the show. And I said, oh, okay, great. There's always this uncomfortable moment when you're asked to be in a show after a certain point in your career where you kind of like are trying to find a euphemism for saying, like, are you going to pay me? And often it comes out as, well, what's your budget? And they said, well, what do you want to do? Do you need to switch? Okay. And so you kind of have to figure out polite ways of talking about that. And so they said, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, what's the budget? And can I come out there? Because it was across the country. And they're like, well, maybe you could do it with instructions. And I was like, okay, you don't have any money. And I was like, well, what's your production budget? What's your travel budget? What's the fee for me, right? And they just didn't really answer. And I kept going and going. So they were like, well, maybe we can do the production here. Maybe we don't have to fly you. I was like, okay, well, what's the artist fee? And like, we didn't budget for artist fees. Meaning they didn't even account for that. They didn't put it in the budget, right? So basically they wanted me to do all this stuff for free. There's a point in your career when this might be a good idea, but the idea of, it's usually like, the reason there's a myth of starving artists is because we often don't ask to be paid. We're like, thank you, and it's treated like such an opportunity. So what I did was I looked up their tax return, and I wanted to make sure before I called back that someone was being paid there. And you can look at how much the executive director is being paid and how much their staff is paid. And so I called back and I said, does everyone work for free there? And they said, no. We all get a salary, a small salary. I was like, is the person who will be sweeping up underneath my piece, will they be paid? And they said yes. And I said, okay, I would like to be paid. If everyone's working for free, I will work for free. But if the guy or the woman or whoever is sweeping up underneath gets paid, I should at least be respected that much as an artist. So this is just an example of this problem. And the folks from W.A.G.E have been working on it for quite some time. And it's always great when you don't feel like you're alone as an artist in dealing with this, or you're being greedy by asking to be paid for anything. So I would like to welcome Lise up here to talk to you about W.A.G.E.
Thanks, I barely need to say anything after that story. Let me just get out my... W.A.G.E is an activist group that advocates for the regulated payment of artist fees by nonprofit arts organizations and museums in New York. And I guess my first question to you guys, just understanding the audience a little bit, are people here artists, or there's some artists? And do you guys ever, are you like familiar with the nonprofit structure and nonprofits in New York? Nods, hands, yes? Okay, okay, good. All right. Introduce that. So W.A.G.E was founded in 2008 by a group of visual and performing artists and independent curators who wondered why, in a similar way, despite having accrued lots of cultural capital, why we were always broke. And there was just something wrong with that equation. So it kind of started by a bunch of informal meetings in people's apartments across New York, or across mostly Brooklyn. And it culminated in the writing of the W.A.G.E Manifesto, which I'm going to play. This video is downstairs also, but I wanted to show it to you.
W.A.G.E works to draw attention to economic inequalities that exist in the arts and to resolve them. W.A.G.E has been formed because we, as visual and performance artists and independent curators, provide a workforce. W.A.G.E recognizes the organized irresponsibility of the art market and its supporting institutions, and demands an end of the refusal to pay fees for the work we are asked to provide. Preparation, installation, presentation, consultation, exhibition, and reproduction. W.A.G.E refutes the positioning of the artist as a speculator and calls for the remuneration of cultural value in capital value. W.A.G.E believes that the promise of exposure is a liability in a system that denies the value of our labor. As an unpaid labor force within a robust art market from which others profit greatly, W.A.G.E recognizes an inherent exploitation and demands compensation. W.A.G.E calls for an address of the economic inequalities that are prevalent and proactively preventing the art worker's ability to survive within the greater economy. W.A.G.E advocates for developing an environment of mutual respect between artist and institution. We demand payment for making the world more interesting.
Wait. Yeah, so that should really be listened to at full volume for full effect. But anyway, so there's a long history of activism around this subject, which Greg really touched on. And I did want to respond to your comment about how this is such an amazing time for political art, which is an incredible thing, but it actually makes being political more difficult, because it means that activist work is more easily institutionalized, because it's so usually welcomed now into the institution. So it actually takes a lot to kind of really say, fuck you, excuse my French. Because it can be so easily just sort of reabsorbed into the institutional politics of wherever you're working. So that's something that W.A.G.E deals with a lot, particularly because we're working with an institution right now. But I'm going to get to that later. So Just a little bit of background. So the Art Workers Coalition was a really important figure for WAGE. They were active between, I think it was 68 and 71 for 3 years. And some of the people that Greg mentioned were really pivotal: Hans Hakke, Lucy Lepard, Faith Ringgold, Carl Andre. But they were galvanized by broader civil rights struggles and anti-war protests. So their demands were many. And so after 3 years of activism, I mean, I say this with the greatest amount of respect, what they ended up with was a free day at museums, which is now sponsored by Target. So after all, I mean, it doesn't matter because what they produced was so important, but it's something that WAGE noted early on, and so we decided to focus on a single achievable goal, which is to make nonprofits pay artist fees, which sounds like, how hard is that? But this has actually been going on, this struggle has been going on since 1972, if you can believe it. So there's this amazing document, I'm going to read you part of this letter, that the experimental filmmaker Hollis Frampton wrote to MoMA in 1972 in response to an invitation to have a retrospective of his work. And I'm just going to read this because it's just such a beautiful document, and you should. It's like 7 pages long, so I'm just going to read like a few paragraphs. So it might be a little jumpy at first because I can't include all the information, but in response he starts, but he says, "And you open your second paragraph with a concise guide to what something is when you say it is all for love and honor and no money is included at all." That was a quote that was included in the letter inviting him to have a retrospective MoMA. And so on to Paul Frampton produces. "All right, let's start with love, where we all started. I have devoted, at the nominal least, a decade of the only life I may reasonably expect to have to making films. I have given to this work the best energy of my consciousness. In order to continue in it, I have accepted, as most artists accept, and with the same gladness, a standard of living that most other American working people hold in automatic contempt. That is, I have committed my entire worldly resources, whatever they may amount to my art. Of course, those resources are not unlimited, but the irreducible point is that I have made the work, have commissioned it of myself, under no obligation to any sort to please anyone, adhering to my own best understanding of the classic canons of my art. Does that not demonstrate love? And if it does not, then how much more am I obliged to do, and who, among the living, is to exact that of me?" And he talked about honor. I'm going to skip that part and get to the money. "But it cannot continue on love and honor alone. And this brings me to your no money is included at all. I'll put it to you as a problem in fairness. I have made, let us say, so and so many films. That means so and so many thousands of feet of raw stock have been expended, for which I paid the manufacturer. The processing lab was paid by me to develop the stuff after it was exposed in a camera, for which I paid. The lens grinders got paid. Then I edited the footage on rewinds and a splicer, for which I paid, incorporating leader and glue, for which I also paid. The printing lab and the track lab were paid for their materials and services. You yourself, however meagerly, are being paid for trying to persuade me to show my work to a paying public for love and honor. If it comes off, the projectionist will get paid. The guard at the door will be paid. Someone or other paid for the paper on which your letter to me was written and for the postage to forward it. That means that I, and my singular person, by making this work, have already generated wealth for scores of people. Multiply that by as many other working artists as you can think of. Ask yourself whether my lab, for instance, would print my work for love and honor if I asked them. And they took my question seriously. I should expect them to have it explained to me ever so gently that human beings expect compensation for their work. The reason is simply that it enables them to continue doing what they do." It's just such a beautiful piece of writing. I encourage you all to read the whole thing. So yeah, this sounds easy, but it's been going on since the early 70s. That letter illustrates the most common kind of equation, which is that artists make work for love. But, and I would say sort of in an updated way, that equation has changed into the exchange of work for exposure. So the offer is we'll show your work and what you'll get is exposure, therefore we don't need to pay you, which means that you'll get paid sometime in the future if you ever get a commercial gallery. So speculation is the only thing you can really have to look forward to. And then I'm just going to test this out on you guys because I think it's interesting. There are other kinds of equations I think that are now offered to artists that kind of come out of academia and come out of the discourse around creative labor. And there's a lot of contradiction and paradox involved in making art, and I think you probably all are somewhat even just intuitively aware of these things. So the first one, the real value of my work is non-monetary, so if you're making like political work, the reason you're making it is not to make money. However, I want to be paid for my work requires time and labor, and I need to earn a living. So in black is kind of the response. When you participate in an exhibition, you and your work enter the public sphere and the marketplace. Your engagement with an arts organization in this capacity is subcontracted labor. And that's really important because that's how W.A.G.E is now framing this discussion. So you see yourself as essentially as an employee, but you'd be not a salaried employee, but subcontracted labor. You know, like when you would like produce a project for somebody, which means that you have to get paid. So artist equals subcontracted labor. Another one, I operate outside of the system in order to remain critical of it. Getting paid means I'm not being critical of the system. So these two things can coexist, but they don't preclude non-payment because payment is just a necessity. This is another one. Both of these things can be true and are true sometimes, and also neither can be true, but they don't justify non-payment either. I must build up my social and cultural capital in order for my work to be perceived as worthy of compensation. So the idea of professionalism, professionalization, the more cultural and social capital I accrue, the more I appear to not need compensation. So the wealthier an artist is, the idea is like, well, why should Jeff Koons get an artist fee if he shows at MoMA? I mean, the fact is Jeff Koons has bazillions of dollars, but he should also get an artist fee, just like me, if I should at MoMA, which I don't. So again, payment for services rendered and content provided is not based on merit. We may live in a meritocracy, but those aren't the rules that we're making. Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is it's okay to work within those contradictions, not to have to resolve them in order to be compensated. So onto what W.A.G.E does. I already gave you some idea. We advocate for the payment of artist fees. We do this in a bunch of different ways. We have different strategies we use, and I guess this is a bumper sticker that is included in the exhibition. We also make videos, but I'm not going to show you this. It was a takedown of the huge art exposition documenta that takes place in Germany, but I don't think I have a chance to show that. We've done all kinds of talks in art fairs, galleries, museums. We've done teach-ins. We've worked with other organizations, and I would say it's really important. We use our skills as artists, but what we do is not art, and we're really clear about that. This is not. Again, I guess this addresses what I was talking before about not being absorbed into institutional politics and into institutions. We're here to achieve real systemic change. So this is a survey that we started. These are the results of the survey that we started working on in 2008. It launched in 2010, where we surveyed about 1,000 artists. It was open; anyone could have taken it, about their experiences with the payment practices of nonprofits in New York between 2005 and 2010. And I'm not going to go into the results because there's a lot of them. But the main thing we found out was that 58% of the people who took this survey did not receive any form of compensation or reimbursement, including the coverage of any expenses, which is just pathetic. I mean, that's really, we were surprised. We didn't know what we were going to find out when we started this survey. But it was good we found that out because it meant there was a lot more work to do. So this became quite a controversial document. This is a list of, I guess you probably can't read it at all. At the bottom are all of there's 64 organizations, and there was also an other category, which is So it's a gradation of who paid and who didn't pay. It started from who, I can't see this either, but I can just tell you what happened. Do you guys know Performa? The biennial performance? So Performa came out just like, yeah, I mean, basically it's like 92% of the time they didn't pay anything. And they're notorious for that. They also don't pay the venues with whom they work. And yeah, they were mad. They were really angry. We didn't set out to shame anybody, although I would say that naming and shaming is kind of part of us. It's not strategic. It's just, you know what, really, it's not strategic. It's just, we're just telling the truth. You know, we're just kind of trying to get an idea of what's actually going on. And that's what's going on. Because there's just no transparency. This is a poster that we made, this is a poster. One of the main problems is that artist fees are not a line item in the operating budgets of nonprofit organizations. So there's actually no way, if you did look up a 990, like you did, you can see what the executive director is making, but you can't see whether artists are being paid fees at all, how much money an organization is spending on that. So right now, W.A.G.E is at the tail end of a research partnership with an organization, a nonprofit called Artist Space. I wish, full disclosure, I am also at the grant writer there. That happened after we started this partnership. But it actually puts me in an interesting position where I fully understand how the organization works. And I write a lot of things that I don't necessarily believe, which is, you know, part of doing one's job. But thankfully I get paid for doing that. So this is the fee schedule of CARFAC. I don't know if anyone knows what CARFAC is. It's the Canadian Artist Representation. They've been going since 1968. In 1975, they were the first, Canada became the first country to start to regulate the payment of fees. But they do that because CARFAC can essentially hold hostage the funding of arts organizations. So they have a mode of accountability with arts organizations. So basically, if they don't pay, they don't get their funding. So we're not in that position here because government funding comprises such a small amount of the funding that arts organizations receive. It's mostly from private foundations and private money and like maybe 30% government and then other earned income. So what W.A.G.E is trying to do right now, since the survey was a major initiative, and then we started working on something called wage certification, which is that the idea is that W.A.G.E certifies organizations that pay fees. Originally, we thought it was just going to be like a fee schedule that looks something like this. So this is CARFAC's fee schedule. They separate it into different categories of size of organization. I think, I'm not sure if it shows it here. Yeah, over 500K and up to 500K. It's a very complex document. You know, we thought the idea of what we were going to do was like to sort of design this fee schedule and then put a kind of wage stamp, certification stamp on, you know, the new museum if they were paying fees, if they could prove to us that that's what they were doing. And we actually did wage certify a show at the new museum, but we decided we didn't want to just do exhibitions, we wanted to do nonprofits as organizations, because there was no point in certifying one show, so you could just do like a tokenistic thing and then it didn't indicate any commitment to actually paying people. So, so this partnership with Artist Space was an opportunity to develop wage certification, which, as I said, we thought was going to be a very simple thing. But we did this really interesting study with their budgets. Again, like I have access, we would have had access to internal budget stuff at Artist Space, whether I worked there or not, but just because I worked there, it enabled me to really dig in and I understood how it all worked. What we figured out was that I looked at what Artist Space, the fees Artist Space had paid. This is 2005. I did from the same time frame as the survey, and then looked at what CARFAC would have recommended for fees during that year, and what Artist Space actually paid. And what was really fascinating, and this really shocked the director of Artist Space, who has really changed things there. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. That only 1% of their entire budget was allotted to paying artists. And if CARFAC had been in charge, they would have only recommended that 3% of the budget would have been allotted to artist fees, which really isn't that much when you think about a budget of $800,000 and the fact that that organization wouldn't exist were it not for the work of the artists that they showed. But it turns out it's not that simple either, because the way that Artist Space works right now, the new director who came in 2009, we don't do these kind of sprawling group shows where artists get like $100 here and there. It's like 4 big shows a year and a huge amount spent on production. So this is an example of budget. Sorry, I know this is really boring. You're like, did I come here to look at operating budgets of arts organizations? But it's actually not boring. It's really important. So if you look at this, so they spent $50,000 on this exhibition. I can't remember whose it is. It doesn't really matter because that is actually pretty typical of what Artist Space spends. But what we learned from this was that, and there you can see the artist fees are actually a line item. They paid a $2,000 artist fee. But that raised the question for us, which was, so what are artists receiving? Artists are receiving lots of other non-monetary compensation, which means they're coming out of their exhibition with like huge amount of like a whole new artwork, potentially like a catalog, and then there's all the cultural capital they like having a show at Artist Space, which is also like, is that immeasurable? That's a question. What is the value of what an arts organization gives an artist outside of the fee? Because in doing this project with Artist Space, it's enabling us to look at both sides of this. So while W.A.G.E loves to say fuck you to art institutions, we also advocate an environment of mutual respect. But that means doing both. Like you can do both, and it's really important that we do. So I'm just kind of bringing you up to date on where we're at with W.A.G.E certification now. So this is like a crazy diagram I made that makes sense to me, but it's just sort of trying to show all the different contingencies. Because I think what we realized after when I showed you that Carfax fee schedule is that wasn't going to work in this case, because what you have in New York are a multiplicity of like a bazillion different kinds of art institutions. Like some own their own buildings, some have huge amounts of rent they have to pay, some have an endowment, some have a very small budget. And we realized that we couldn't actually just make W.A.G.E certification a kind of one-size-fits-all thing. It had to actually be tailored to each organization. But then, how do you do that? What does that actually mean in practice? And so when we did a project that actually Greg and I were in the same festival in Graz last year, they wanted us to W.A.G.E certify this festival. So it's like, well, we could try, but let's just start let's just start talking. And I was working with the administrator, and administrators are always the easiest people to work with. I'm not really sure why, much easier than the directors. And the administrator put this question to me, which no one had really ever asked before, which was, what does equity mean to W.A.G.E? Like, what is fairness to you? And after some discussion, we came up with this statement, which I'll just read along with you. Equity begins with recognizing that the contribution made by cultural producers is integral to the functioning of an arts institution. Financial compensation for this contribution acknowledges its value. Payment must be conceived and established in direct relation to what an institution chooses to pay its employees and subcontractors. So this is sort of starting to bring what W.A.G.E certification is into focus. Again, it's like these very basic principles. The institution wouldn't exist without us. Compensation acknowledges the value of that, and that's essential. And that artists are subcontracted labor. But the new thing is that it has to be that we want the fee to be determined in direct relation to what other people are getting paid. So this was intended to be a gift. I was hoping like you could slide this thing up your head, and the artist would get bigger or smaller depending on what it was being compared to. But I guess what we realized was that we can't just advocate for artists to get paid. We actually have to look at what everyone in the organization is getting paid. It's not, if you're going to look at labor, it's really important to do that. Because we're really like artists really are as kind of figure of a precarious worker that you guys are all in the media, I think, so you are like the upcoming generation of precarious workers. Subcontractors, workers who work part-time with no health insurance, no security. And this is what artists have been doing for generations. That's what you're doing. So it's really important that, I think it's really important that we look at all of the labor. Also, it's like, why should the director be making $100,000 and then keeping the artist fee at $2,000? It just started to not make sense. And I was like, well, if we're going to do this project, we really could do it, And so it ended up starting to look like is that we're essentially kind of turning an arts organization into like a socialist, like mini ecosystem. I mean, it's like, yeah, that's all clap. So these are, but on the other hand, we have to make sure that this is viable, because we're not going to wage certify anybody if we're saying, okay, sorry, director, your salary is going to come down from 80,000 to 30,000. They're going to say, fuck you, wage. We're not doing this, because what we're doing, wage certification relies on wages cultural capital within the art world. So what we're relying on is that arts organizations want the wage stamp of approval, because we've been doing this for long enough that we're, pretty well known in the New York art world. But if this is prohibitive, they're not going to go for it. So that's why this is still in development, but it is close to being done. So this is the first principle. Artist fees must be paid. The artist fee is separate from and must not be used to cover travel, accommodation, installation, shipping, or other expenses, because that often happens where they'll give you $2,000 and they'll say, okay, make the work and take your fee out of what's left over. This is also really important for us, this visible line item in budgets. So the size of the fee is determined in direct relation to the size of the total budget. It gets a little bit technical, but this is where we're starting to go with this. It's like turning into a kind of potentially an equation, like a mathematical equation. So, for example, say this is one scenario. Say the director makes $80,000 and the organization does 10 exhibitions a year. If you divide 80,000 by 10, each artist could get paid $10,000. This is one. So this is what we're talking about, looking at the fee in relation to the other forms of compensation. So this is like one possibility. So the salaries of the other employees and subcontracted workers. That's self-explanatory. This is another point. When decreases in funding occur, the artist fee, because this is another way in which artist fees can just be eliminated. This would be like the recession argument, like, our funding has dropped, we can't afford to pay you anymore. So this would be a way of saying that's not okay, you can't do that. Yeah, I think I covered this last point, but the fee is a starting point in considering the value of all labor within an organization. So what we're thinking right now is that we're not gonna insist necessarily that the director's salary come down. Like I said, we don't want to make it prohibitive, but we might have a set of recommendations. And I think we're also looking at including questions about how many women artists do you show? How many people of color do you show? I mean, we can't sort of become the wage police. That's not the intention. But once we start thinking about equity, and we have an intake form that organizations fill out when they start this process with us. One of the questions, we turned it around again and said, what does equity mean to an organization? And I think it's really important that has to be addressed holistically. So I don't know how long I've been talking, but I'm just going to leave you with our most recent equation, our most recent wage throb, which means the transparent holistic ratio of budget. So that's looking at the total budget in a transparent and holistic fashion and everything in relation to every other thing. And that's kind of where we are with wage certification. Thank you.